I am so excited to introduce our next guest. Our first is Bethke from Intel. She's coming all the way from Silicon Valley, and she works on Intel's AI for Social Good initiative for the company. Next is Professor S. Matthew Liao. Matt is a friend of mine from the Center of Bioethics at NYU. In New York City. Matt and I go back a long way, a long time, family, friends, etc. And he's got a wonderful perspective as a philosopher, as an academic as well. He's also going to be publishing a paper on artificial intelligence and ethics as well, in conjunction with, can I say who? Okay, with Google and a couple other folks. That's coming out in January, so we're very excited. And you may even be able to share something with us today about what you'll try, right? And our last guest is Eva Wimmers from Huawei Honor. Eva is based here in NRW, and it's so excited that Eva joined us. So we have representation between Germany, United States, and of course, China as well, with a Chinese company that you work for. And I'm really, really excited that they're here. And let's just get right into it. This is a hot topic. This is the topic when it comes to artificial intelligence and, the effect on humans and our society and how we work and operate, et cetera. And so, these algorithms are already impacting our lives today, and where people are no longer the consumers, are actually the products, right, with data underlying, et cetera. So the conversation about, let's start about the difference. When we think of AI, we think about robots taking over jobs and all that stuff. There's a difference between artificial intelligence and natural intelligence. Matt, do you want to kind of explain where we're coming from this, from like a philosophical and societal view?
Sure. So I look at, so I'm a philosopher, and I sort of look at these things from a more big picture perspective. And the way I see it is, so there's sort of near-term AI and near-term AI ethical issues. So that's what we're talking about with respect to like a lot of the things that are being discussed today. Things like machine learning, data, big data, and sort of analysis of the data. And then there's some sort of longer term. That's when like AI scientists, when they first were thinking about this, they were much more ambitious. They were thinking about having human level intelligence. So that's sometimes called artificial general intelligence, and that's sort of the holy grail. A lot of AI research, not everybody, but a lot of AI researchers, that's what they're aiming for when they're thinking about AI.
Right. And so when it comes to what is the human part of this equation? Any of you can answer this. What is the human part of this equation?
Yeah, a lot of the systems work best when there's both a human and the automation working together. So we talk about levels of automation where 5 is a fully autonomous, especially when you're thinking about autonomous driving. But right now we're somewhere around like 2 or 3, where the automation is making some decisions where the human is making other ones. And with all of these, you're always going to have like the human in the equation when they are building the data sets, when they're building the algorithms themselves. So, and that's really important because we're better at some things, whereas an automation is better at other things. Take medical imagery, for instance. You can detect cancer using like object detection types of things. But you're going to want to send that information to a doctor, to a radiologist, who then also looks at this information and prescribes the diagnoses, et cetera. So that's one way that it can fit in.
I think a very important part is also that AI is not contextual. So AI can detect the dog at the street, but when the dog crosses the street, it doesn't know why it crosses the street. And I, as a person, I have a feeling, I know why I'm doing this, I have feelings about this, and I also know what it's supposed to be. So I think this is something which probably is the biggest fear in everyone, that this could ever be done by AI anytime soon, that people can feel and act exactly in the context like AI can feel and act in the context like a person.
So do you think that AI, they're going to achieve human level moral status, or will they have like rights as right holders in society? Do you think that's coming?
Goodness, everyone's looking towards me. I think it's a very long ways off, if it's ever going to be there. One of the last talks sort of spoke about how we're the ones that are inputting this information into the system. So we're saying, oh yeah, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is, this is right, this is wrong. And so even if the AI today is saying this is morally objectable, it's because we have told it to say that. So, if there's something in like 20, 30, 50 years, it's really hard to say, but we're definitely not there at the current moment because it's all human taught.
Let's elaborate a little further more about kind of like the data and the decision making, like what is between a machine and a human, etc., the decision making part of it.
Well, so right now, one of the big issues in the near-term AI ethics is sort of whether the human should be in the loop in the decision-making process, or whether they should be completely outside the loop. So take a self-driving car. Right now, the humans are still in the loop, but they're trying to get to a place where you can just sit back and watch your movies while the car is driving. Same with things like autonomous weapons. There's obviously that can really go really wrong if humans are outside the loop. So there are actually a whole campaign. There are a bunch of AI scientists who are saying, no, we should really just ban that completely, because if you take humans outside the loop and the classification gets wrong, you end up killing a bunch of people. Now, just to get into the issues about sort of AI moral status, I think we're very far off from being able to do that, because right now what we have is something called narrow AI, which is sort of basically just classification, a lot of fitting of data, et cetera, et cetera. What we don't have is sort of this general intelligence where something can learn, learn a bunch of things on its own, learn how to make coffee, et cetera, and that's what Eva was talking about. But I think that there are paths, and we can talk about this later. But I think there are paths. So I'll just say one thing, which is the Human Brain Project in Europe now. For example, there are a lot of people who are trying to emulate the brain. They're emulating sort of elegance. These are these worms. There's sort of 500 some neurons. They basically emulated every single neuron of the C. elegans, and they're trying to emulate also the mice brains. And once you have a computational model and it can do everything exactly like what the worms can do or what the mouse can do, then you're getting to a close where you might be able to run getting that type of sort of emulated intelligence.
Well, I think since we're discussing whether this should happen or not, there's a moral question behind it too, right? And I'm not so sure this is true what we all think, because where is the proof that the human decision is the ethical one? There's not much proof in the world about that, right? Wouldn't it actually make the world better if the machine was doing it or not? Or who's building the machine? I mean, the AI is a tool and it's a technology, and it will reflect whatever the bias, whatever the technology's been taught to do. So it can be as bad or as good as people are being, and whatever it's been fed. It can be as bad in the bias as the data was in the past it's been fed with, even if nobody teaches it to do a right or wrong decision. But in essence, there's actually no proof that a person decision, for example, in war, is the more ethical one. So
it's a really complex topic right now, especially around ethical AI, and a lot of groups, universities, as well as industry is looking at this because it's really important for us to ask these questions. And we know that a lot of times the data sets that we're utilizing can be biased because the underlying data can be biased because our underlying society is biased. So one of the biggest things that we've been looking at is how do we, make our algorithms less biased when we're sitting on layers upon layers of these potential biases. And it's complex because if you change your algorithm one way, then you might make it more fair in one aspect, but make it less fair in another. So, and that could actually hurt the disadvantaged people more so than, a different case. Actually, there was a conference this summer called the International Conference on Machine Learning, and one of the best papers, it was awarded the best paper, was talking about this juxtaposition of the various ways to measure fairness, because there's a lot of them.
So maybe I can just comment on both issues. So I don't think we want to relativize morality that much. I mean, we definitely make moral decisions. So I think everybody in this room would agree that torture innocent babies for fun is wrong.
No,
right?
no, we don't do
yeah.
that. We
right?
don't do that.
And so if a
No,
machine
no.
starts to like somehow through
Bad.
unsupervised reinforcement learning starts to torture innocent babies for fun, we think that's wrong, right?
Right.
So but it gets more complex, right? So when you get into self-driving cars, right? Cars gonna try to is on its way to hit 5 people, but you can drive it onto one side, but it's going to run over some other person. That's a moral dilemma, and so that there are moral dilemmas, and we need to figure those out. And so when you're programming as a programmer, that one of the issues is, do you actually need to solve the ethical problem already before you program? Right? Or can the machine help you do that? And right now, I don't think our machines can do that just because it doesn't have that kind of understanding, that kind of moral understanding that we typically require of a moral agent. On the bias issue, I think I think Anna is absolutely right. They're different layers and different issues with respect to fairness. Sorry, this thing is
Right,
tripping
sorry
me up.
about that. We're missing our flight.
No, that's right. So
We're on the train instead.
So like
Deutsche Bahn.
fairness, for example, there are actually different measures of fairness, right? So one way to look at, you can sort of look at it in terms of meritocracy, like are we measuring merit? Another is sort of historical injustice, right? People might not be as meritocratic, but in part because we did something wrong to them in the past. And so in the overall system, all things considered, we want to take in both of those factors. And so how do machines go about figuring out that? So if you just enter something, if the data is purely based on merits, then you're going to miss out the other part, right? Or if it's on the other part, you're going to miss out on the merits. And then there's sort of the other part, which is sort of what happens when we try to overcompensate, like, in terms of historical injustice, and we might get things wrong there as well. And so that's a different kind of bias that's introduced in programming, but I think it's actually useful to distinguish different types of biases and build that into the program.
Eva.
Yeah, maybe just one thing. I mean, I'm sure we can find some really, really low-level common denominators, such as that, hopefully, at least otherwise we're all lost in society, right, if we can't find that.
Right.
However, it's, let's say, it also depends on what kind of job the AI is supposed to do. We were talking earlier in the coffee shop about another example. Let's say you're building an engine, a prediction engine, with the help of AI to say in the US which person that was criminally convicted of something is going to become criminal again, to give them, put them on parole or so. If you leave bias out of the equation, in this whole ecosystem, which is already biased because we don't live in a perfect world, you might get it wrong. If you put it back in, you turn it into a self-fulfilling bias prophecy, right? So I think in some areas where AI is used, for example, in prediction and taking decisions, particularly when it's about anything that is related to something ethical, it gets really tricky with the bias, whether you should have it in or not. So in those cases, nobody has the real truth, or it's also very difficult to define. You were saying earlier, what is right or wrong, right? And if you, on the bottom level, I think very fairly easily we all agree we don't do this to babies. But in the middle layer, depending on where you grew up, what environment you live in, what kind of person you are, you might have very different opinions on what is right or wrong.
Maybe, can I jump on?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I
Please.
think that's a good opportunity to think of like AI and its technologies and like the work that Anna's doing as like one of the inputs into sort of our decision making, but we shouldn't think of it as the only input. So if we were to just rely purely on sort of like if you're trying to decide sort of parole sentencing and you just use only the AI, you might get it completely wrong for the reasons that you named. But so like just in prison cases, there are a lot of initiatives now. People are sort of going into prisons, like so prison education reform, for example. Like we need to supplement it if we're worried about, so this is sort of basically decision under moral uncertainty, right? And we want to minimize the risk of people recidivism, basically. And so we need to go there, like you need to have multiple strategies, not just rely on AI, but you actually want to make sure that your prison system is sort of, it's an environment where people won't be, they won't be scarred for life when they come out of it, like where they're actually learning something, while like good things rather than bad things, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to, we can't just look at AI, we need to build in a whole system in there to make it work better.
So corporations obviously have a big say in the industry and moving forward, not just on work, but decisions and some of the things that are being programmed. What are corporations doing? What are your companies doing in the industry that's good for the industry in this conversation?
There's a number of things, and one of the really great things, especially in AI, is that we're very open about sharing them. So it sort of came back from the academia world, where if you're not publishing what you're doing, if you're not putting your code out on GitHub, then it's almost as if you're not actually doing that work. So that's been really lovely to be able to have these different collaborations. So there's both formal, informal ones where part of the partnership on AI, which is looking a lot at AI ethics as well as how do we have AI in society. But then some of the other types of projects that we're doing is working with local and state like organizations, working with nonprofits in order to really help them influence and positively impact their people. And I totally agree that whenever you're using an algorithm, whenever you're using any like an AI type of machine, you need to have the resources too on the back end to support it. So one of the projects that I heard about was, helping identify those individuals that need to be on more welfare. So getting them to the resources that they deserve and really need to improve their lives. But one of the issues is that if you're working with an organization or working with a city that doesn't then have the right amount of funds, doesn't have the right programs to provide them with, the AI can only do so much. So.
Well, Huawei has been for a long time working on the IFL too, for the phones area and also for the infrastructure and the IT infrastructure area. By the way, Honor launched the very first AI phone in 2016 in China with 200 partners, so coming together and agreeing on the standard, because we all agree everything in digital is always connected, and no company alone can be in a dominant market position anymore without the help of partners and other companies and services. So it's a big target to work together, which is a fundamental value of Huawei as a company. And we come from from the telco world, where actually people have done this for a long time, and there's some examples which we might want to bring into the AI world. For example, the so-called GCF certificate, which is on the basis of the definition of all stakeholders in the telco industry, like network operators and vendors, and they define test cases, and people do a self-assessment actually, how they test it against these cases. Some are physical, some are software tests, and then you can get the certificate. And so a customer in the end can decide, I don't want to go for a company that hasn't done the self-assessment, so you get the customer power, because at least they have made a certain effort here. And you can take it even a step farther. You could say we build a green angel for AI, so that those companies who want to really be a role model, they can actually do additional, let's say, bias test, right, to check the system in certain areas to do really good. And the advantage of this versus a pure regulation coming from politics in the country is it will be done by those experts who really are top-notch in what is coming, what problems are actually coming up with the development of the technology. It would be independent. It would be actually international and not coming from local knowledge. And so these are the types of activities that Huawei has also always participated highly in, because they believe that you can only push. Actually, they always think that competition enlivens the business, because otherwise the technology will never grow.
And Matt, final words from you. You are writing a book now about the ethics in AI and penning and paper. What can we see from you coming out?
So I'm editing this volume on the ethics of artificial intelligence, and there are a bunch of contributors from Google, Facebook, and one of the things I'll just say is that many of these corporations, Facebook, Google, maybe because of what they do, they've created ethics boards. They've invited people from the academia, philosophers, to sit on these ethics boards, and I think they really sort of enjoy that type of collaboration with people from the academia. And it's great for us as well, because we learn a lot about the sort of what's actually happening, and we can help shape the discussion. And so the conversations have been really great. And I hope that it's one of the reasons why I was so excited to come here, because I think that the technology is really complex. We need everybody. Everybody's a stakeholder in this, and we need to have this kind of conversation.
Okay. The panelists have agreed to answer one or two questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question that they want to ask? Okay. Patrick, first hand, FIFO.
Hey, fascinating discussion. And I've just been thinking about what you were talking about with fairness. I've never thought too much about this. But people think like fairness is one of those innate human things. We have this like innate moral outrage when things are unfair. And you think that because you get a group of children, you give all but one of them a candy cane, and the one who didn't get one is like, hey, it's not fair, I didn't get one. But if you think about it, it's really just sort of an innate moral outrage at, hey, I didn't get the thing that I wanted. And it's not until we go through those experiences a lot, and we eventually develop, instead of a selfish thing, more of a Nash algorithm, kind of thing, where you've averaged over all these unfair situations and figured out like what is the best distribution of things that we now as adults call fairness. If that makes any sense. But so I'm wondering, it just occurred to me, like you could just create a whole bunch of selfish agents that you put through situations and expect that maybe over time in some simulated environment they're going to achieve this kind of Nash equilibrium type of idea of fairness that would allow them to... Is this something you've ever heard of, or do you have any reason to think it would work?
It isn't something that I've necessarily heard of. It would be really interesting, because right now one of the algorithms that's often used in deep learning especially is called reinforcement learning, and that has a lot of simulated environments where you are training an agent over and over again. The hard thing is like modeling all of those types of scenarios and such. Even like getting a robot arm to like move, you have to have a lot of programmatics in there. The thing, though, that it really does reflect upon is making certain that whenever you are developing these algorithms, you have a very diverse set of people that are working on it. So both like engineering, so different like races, different ages, different places that they grew up, because we all have like some shared, averages over our histories, but other people, have slightly different instantiations that they have seen. And so that's important, and like to talk to academics, to talk to philosophers, to talk to these subject matter experts and wherever you're going. And that's a way that you can get a better like average of the averages to be more fair.
The question to me would be of this concept in doing it. It would assume that this machine has some kind of understanding or empathy or pity, right? I mean, if it should learn from an outcome which was undesirable, which things could actually happen that the machine would learn? Would it care if somebody complains and screams? Would it care if somebody then can't live properly anymore and is underprivileged? I mean, it assumes that from negative feedback, this machine can learn from it. But which are those cases where this would actually really happen?
Yeah, so let me just jump in here. So this is actually a long-standing debate in philosophy. So there's, on one camp, there's Thomas Hobbes, all the way back in the 1600s who say that
A person is a bad person, right?
No, it's sort of from self-interest, you're not gonna get at best you're gonna get something like enlightened self-interest. So you get a group of people, they realize that life is nasty, brutish, and short in the state of nature, and so they kind of have to band together. But it's an enlightened form of self-interest. But it's some people think that's the best we can get, even for humans. And then there are other people who think, like people like Immanuel Kant, who thinks that maybe what we need to do things not just because they're in our best interest, but also because it's right? And so this gets into from prudential, rational agency to moral agency. And there's a big debate in AI whether, and it's called the orthogonality thesis, whether rational agency come apart from moral agency. And so there are a lot of people who are talking about artificial moral agency and what that is needed, the components that are needed to go into that. And that's going to look very different from just rational agency, because you can have something that's really smart, but they're completely amoral. And so they can sort of do things in order to promote their interests or like the interests of those of their kind, but not necessarily do the moral thing.
So that's all the time we have. All our panelists will be at the networking party tonight, as well as Kathleen will remind us too. And thank you so much for coming to Cologne, you guys, to talk. And we'll see you at the next one. So, thank you.